It is February 23rd, 2024, which means that on this week, 2 years ago, Russian President Putin announced that Russia would be recognizing the independence of the republics in the Donbass. He then went on to announce the beginning of a special military operation in Ukraine. And little did we know that in the course of just 2 years that this would change the dynamics on the international stage in a way that we haven't seen for quite some time. It would put Russia in a position where it would be reducing its reliance on the West in record time. Why? Well, because the West, thanks to the US and the EU and the UK, they went above and beyond to make Russia the most sanctioned nation in the world. Their goal was to isolate Russia from the rest of the world, to destroy the Russian economy. And yet, 2 years later, and they have accomplished none of those goals. And so, what are they doing? Well, the EU is working on new sanctions. Biden just announced 500 new sanctions against Russia. They're acting as if these measures are going to be what turns the tide of the conflict, or maybe it's going to be that $60 billion in aid that Biden is trying to get Congress to pass right now. We had a discussion earlier in which we took a look at not just the latest measures and the impact that they could have, but we also looked at where this conflict stands as we go into the third year of the current phase of the conflict in Ukraine that has been going on for a decade now. And that, of course, started with some Western intervention, and that wouldn't be possible without that continued Western intervention and support for the Kiev regime. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Rachel, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Always good to have you. And I know that we have spent a lot of time over the last year talking about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. We are, of course, now at the 2 year anniversary of when Russian President Putin announced that special military operation. And Biden is commemorating this anniversary by announcing 500 new sanctions against Russia. So, what do we know about these measures? And is there anything different or groundbreaking that we haven't already seen in all of the sanctions that the US has imposed against Russia over the last 2 years?
Yeah, it's fascinating when the Western media has been forced to admit that all of the hundreds and hundreds, thousands of sanctions that have been tossed on Russia uh, since 2014, even more since 2002, that they have not had certainly haven't had the desired effect on the Russian economy. The Washington Post, in its article on this new round of sanctions today, admitted, however grudgingly, that the Russian economy grew faster than the American economy last year. So, not to mention many European economies, Germany facing recession, and according to its own press, rapid and traumatic deindustrialization, mostly as a result of cutting themselves off from Russian gas and the blowback from their own rounds of sanctions against what had been one of their largest trade partners. This new round of sanctions is intended to be devastating. All right, so that the previous rounds were intended to crush the Russian economy. We were told like time and time again, but this time it's really going to crush the Russian economy. Yeah, not so much. The majority, a large number of these sanctions are targeted against individuals, right? 500 sounds like a really big number. A lot of them are targeted against individuals because the death of the Russian criminal far-right ultranationalist / Western intelligence asset Alexei Navalny in a Russian prison is being used as an excuse for more sanctions by the West, which is telling us how much it is outraged that a Russian criminal and ultranationalist died in a Russian prison. It's amazing that they weren't similarly outraged when an American journalist, Gonzalo Lira, died in a Ukrainian prison. after claiming he was tortured and in Ukrainian prison for the crime of criticizing the U.S.-backed government in Kiev, which one would think on a English language platform that is owned by the United States, YouTube. You would think that the U.S. Should have been outraged about that, but they weren't. In fact, they tried to quiet it down and basically said the Kiev regime, had good reason to lock him up for his political views. But democracy, freedom, and all of that, rah rah. So a great deal of these sanctions are against individuals. I said going after people in the Russian political and prison system. One of them have probably been sanctioned multiple times before. They're also going after Russian, the defense industry, the technology industry, and materials, that could be considered dual use. That is not expected, of course, to have a very big effect because the United States doesn't do much business with the Russian defense industry. But this is probably preliminary. Once these sanctions are applied, the US will then put sanctions on other countries and companies in other countries that then do business with the Russian defense industries. We've seen, of course, sanctions against Russian defense industries before. They have not had a very large effect thus far. There is no particular reason that these will be any more crushing, but they regard it as a further tightening of the screws, and the screws mostly being put on the rest of the world for daring to continue to trade with Russia is the ultimate target of this. And indeed, within this round of sanctions, they are going after more companies around the world that continue to trade with Russia in defiance of the US's unilateral sanctions, because we all know that what the US say goes all over the world because of the rules-based order. They make the rules and they give the orders. So secondary sanctions are also a big part of this round of sanctions as well. And the European Union, just in the last week, also dovetailed with their own 13th round of sanctions. And there's a degree of overlap between the two of them. They're also attempting to attack the Russian diamond industry, which will probably lead, much like with the sanctions on Russia's oil and gas products, simply Europeans buying Russian diamonds just through a middleman in Turkey or India or Africa or elsewhere in the world, as the US and the EU will continue to play their game of whack-a-mole, sanctioning the rest of the world for daring to continue to trade with Russia.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I think that 13th round of sanctions is really going to be what does it, right? It's going to be the lucky number, or at least maybe that's what they
Yeah,
continue
I've
to tell
I've, I've got
themselves.
my survival shelter and everything ready for the collapse of the Russian economy. Not really.
If the EU, they can keep dreaming, and I know that they
Yeah.
will. Now, it's been interesting because as you pointed out there has been this focus and almost this obsession with the death of Alexei Navalny, right? You've got Biden meeting with Navalny's family in California, and he is talking about these sanctions, and he's acting as if, oh, this is some sort of vengeance for, as you pointed out, the guy who is a Russian criminal who was in prison serving his time there. Biden has been quick to put the blame on Putin, even though he didn't even know how he died. He didn't know his cause of death. So, what do you make of this obsession that the West has with Navalny? They describe him as an opposition leader, but yet he doesn't have the public support in Russia. Is this almost trying to distract from what's actually going on in Ukraine right now?
Yeah, they are very angry because in their long list of their proclaimed leaders of other countries, like Juan Guaido and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and numerous others, they've had an asset removed from the board. However, he died, and I'll be honest, I don't know. There hasn't been any autopsy report yet. The investigation is still underway. Did the Russian government decide to finally get rid of him? Being as him and his organization, his people were caught openly negotiating how many millions of dollars they needed to start a color revolution campaign on Russia's streets, to which, of course, he had no reaction whatsoever to. But there's other evidence that was released against him in court that was not revealed to the public, of course, because that would ruin intelligence sources. But his first time he was sent to prison was actually for fraud against a French cosmetics company, Yves Rocher, among others, that he was involved in. So he's a petty two-bit criminal on top of his background in Russia, which is not widely publicized in the West, of course. You won't read, if you go back far enough, you can find it. If you go back in the press, but this has all been whitewashed out of his record. He started out as a Russian ethnic ultra-nationalist. He led race riots outside Moscow. He was an ultra-nationalist, a xenophobe, an Islamophobe, and a bigot. He ran commercials in the beginning of his career in Moscow, comparing people, migrants, immigrants, and in general, the people of Russia from the South Caucasus as cockroaches or as cavities that needed to be exterminated and removed. And considering that he was a pro-gun nut as well, anything to be like the United States, he suggested the solution to this problem of these people, these cockroaches, these cavities, was to hand out guns to all ethnic Russians in Russia. But of course, this wouldn't have destabilized Russia. This is perfectly normal, and the West would perfectly accept a person like this in politics in their own societies, right? It's just further evidence that the U.S. will support anyone and anything, be it far-right death squads in South and Central America and dictators, jihadis in Libya and Afghanistan back in the 1980s, and jihadis again in Syria, any time of extremists, even left-wing Kurdish guerrillas in Syria and Turkey, if it suits their geopolitical interests, right? They regard them as tools to be used. Of course, these tools also regard the U.S. as tools to be used, but that's the way these things works. And Alexei Navalny was a perfect example of this. His death is of course being blamed on Putin. Gonzalo Lira's death is not being blamed on Zelensky, of course, and it's being declared a tragedy in the United States, right? And I have to say that far more people, his real constituency in the West, particularly in the United States, regard it as a tragedy than Russians do. He regularly polled, according to his own polling, 1 or 2% support in the country. That has, of course, gone down over the last few years. But never fear, there is a new Russian opposition leader.
Oh.
We know this because the Associated Press told us that there is a new Russian opposition leader. His wife, Yulia Navalny, she had, despite having no track record herself in politics, she stayed out of his political activist, ultranationalist, criminal affairs, supposedly. And for the last few years, while he's been in prison, evidently she's been hanging out with her boyfriend, Chichvarkin, a Russian self-exiled oligarch, and there's numerous pictures of them looking all lovey-dovey together, completely innocently, at various resorts around the world. And Navalny's own mother has come out with a furious attack on Yulia Navalny. about how she's profiteering off his death, how she was spending, all this time over this years with this oligarch boyfriend, and so forth and so on. But none of that makes any difference. She is the new opposition leader in Russia. The Associated Press proclaimed her so. I don't know if anyone in the Russian opposition, certainly the real Russian opposition, the communists might be a little confused about this. The Russian soft nationalists of LDPR may be cocking their heads in a little bit of surprise to hear this news. And even Russia's pro-Western liberals, as few as there are in the country, they may be surprised by this news. But she has been anointed so by Joe Biden. Previously, she just happenstance to be in Munich for the security conference last week when her husband died. Just by sheer coincidence, she was delivering an address at the Munich security conference there. Very interesting timing, and I don't want to delve into coincidence theory or anything like that, but you can take that for what it is. But we also have been alerted that actually she's gone already. Because Joe Biden announced just hours after meeting with Yulia Navalnaya, the new Russian opposition leader. And if the senile octogenarian president of the United States says hours after meeting with Yulia Navalnaya that Yolanda Navalnaya is now the Russian opposition leader. I don't know where Yolanda exactly is from. Maybe she's from South Jersey. I don't know Yolanda. I'm not familiar with that name in Russia. But when he was speaking to the press in LA, Joe Biden announced that the new Russian opposition leader has already changed from Yulia Navalnaya to Yolanda Navalnaya. I haven't heard of this woman yet. I doubt that anyone else in Russia has either. But we're all eagerly awaiting to find out who our new opposition leader.
See, you had me there for a minute. I was going, they've already changed up that fast, but you're right. Maybe Biden was just onto some wishful thinking, or he thought that.
No. If the U.S. president said it, I believe him. It's Yolanda. Do you remember when Mike Pompeo referred to the new president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido?
Yes, yeah. And where is he now, right? I always wonder about that. What is Juan Guaido up to?
Pompeo or
Juan
Guaido?
Exactly. Either one, it doesn't matter. As long as they do the U.S. bidding, whatever administration of the moment, they do not care. And, it's interesting because while Biden is having these meetings, while he's choosing the new opposition leader, you have Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer in Kiev today. Now, he's there to kind of reassure Zelensky that everything's fine, that the U.S., still supports the Kiev regime, insisting that, that $60 billion, it will get passed. What do you make of his latest visit and really where U.S. support for Ukraine stands right now?
Yeah. Chuck Schumer, of course, was the man who pushed the bill through the U.S. Senate for this aid, but it is still languishing in the House, and everything depends on one man, the Speaker, Mike Johnson. And I will tell you that I am personally surprised that he has not already put it up for a vote. If the bill is put up for a vote in the U.S. House of Representatives, I believe it will pass. I believe that there are enough Republicans who will vote for it, simply because it is amazing how effectively a relatively small group of Republicans in the House, from, shall we say, the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party, have been able to hold this bill up for months now. And actually put its ultimate fate in jeopardy. This is a huge surprise to me. I'm always still convinced that it is far more about petty domestic partisan politics, sticking it to Biden and his war, than it is any actual principled position against a proxy war in Ukraine. But, that is domestic politics in the U.S. What can you say? But Mike Johnson has said that he will not, publicly, he has said that he will not put this bill up to a vote unless it contains provisions on border security, which is, what this fight in the House and Senate have been over for months. And unable to reach a compromise with them, the Biden administration just stripped it entirely and basically, made to call their bluff. And everything is on Mike Johnson. If Mike Johnson does not put this up for a vote in the House, he will be singularly proclaimed as the man who handed Ukraine to Putin. Never mind, of course, that this bill is not going to change the ultimate outcome of the war, and it's far more about the inability of the US and NATO's military industrial complex, no matter how much money you throw at it, to manufacture the needed munitions, artillery shells, air defense missiles for this conflict, because they're just not geared up for it. And you can print money, right? We all know quantitative easing. The U.S. government loves printing money. Some 30, I don't know, what is it, up $35 trillion worth? We're told it's going to be up to 50 trillion before we even know it. So what's a few more, but you can't print artillery shells. Certainly not in any time frame that will matter to the regime in Kiev. So it's not really about that, but of course that is the pressure that will be applied to him, and he will have to balance between domestic issues and President Trump, who has frowned on this very publicly and is the presumed Republican heir apparent candidate for the presidency this year, unless, I don't know, they manage to finally find a criminal case that sticks against him, or do a Kennedy on him or something of the sort. But he's going to have to balance that. And I'm surprised he's held out this far. And being in the US, you can probably make a better judge than I can what he will ultimately go down on, which side. We have heard from several European leaders, NATO Secretary General, some other leaders in Europe, that he privately assured them at one point, at least, that he would put it up for a vote in the House.
Yeah.
So
I was gonna say I do. I'm with you on that one. I think that the vote is coming. He's just trying to make it look good to his constituents because I think the latest poll is up to 70% now of Americans who want to see an end to the war in Ukraine. They want to see talks, and so Mike Johnson is in that place where he knows it's going to get passed. However, he's trying to kind of wait it out and make it look like he did something before he actually passes it on his end.
That's the cynic in you speaking out. I love to hear it.
I know that they will eventually, but yeah, I think it's all about optics. Now, we are obviously going into the third year of this current phase of the conflict in Ukraine. What are you keeping an eye on when it comes to what we're actually seeing on the battlefield and where things stand, even as you were pointing out there, when that $60 billion does get passed, it's not going to be the magic thing that turns the tide the way some members of Congress would like to act like it is.
Well, while that $60 billion, if it's passed, will not magically print artillery shells, one thing it will do is provide the Kiev regime for financing for something that they've put off for months, which is the mass forced conscription of some new 500,000, some 500,000 civilians that they intend to forcibly conscript into the military. Conscripting civilians, the press gangs, the minuscule salaries, the life, the payments going out to those who die, at least those who aren't declared missing, which is the majority, but that's another issue. They haven't been able to fund it. And that is ultimately the most important thing that U.S. taxpayer dollars will go to, is the press gangs and the mass forced conscription of 500,000 Ukrainians to send into the trenches. So that is vital. It won't save the Kiev regime, but it will postpone their ultimate fall, and it will raise costs for Russia and for Ukraine. And considering the demographic crisis facing Ukraine, which we have talked about before, it will be a cost that will be paid by future Ukrainian generations more than anything else. The Kiev regime has made perfectly clear that they are completely on the defensive this year. There is no even talk of building up a new NATO geared and trained army for offensives. They simply don't have the military equipment necessary for it. And it's very hard to see where they will be able to in the next few years to generate that now. So I think it's all about defense and raising the costs for Russia now, hoping it will force them eventually to the negotiating table on terms that are more favorable to the U.S. I mean the Kiev regime in Ukraine, because that's really who's making the decisions, right? Meanwhile, Russia will build on their success in liberating Avdiivka, the strongest, most fortified fortress city of the Kiev regime. Has been liberated. Many Western military experts called it the most fortified position on earth. Well, it's not anymore. And Russia is building on that in the immediate area. But the Kiev regime, they're applying pressure all over the contact line, all straight up and down the entire length. And there are several very important settlements that Russian troops are now fighting like in the streets for. So it's already down to street battles. Novomihailovka is one south of Avdiivka that is quite important and could lead up to then the cutting off of supply lines to the even further south fortress city of Ugledar, which Russia has failed in straight up battles to take before. But that cutting off the supply lines could be the job that does it and wraps up all of South Donetsk. But Ivanovskaya, a move on Chasiv Yar, the Kiev regime's fallback point from losing Bakhmut last year, that's also on the table. But more importantly, the Kiev regime is very much worried right now about two massive buildups of Russian forces. One in the north towards Kupiansk and Liman in the Kharkov and northern Donetsk region. And in the south, in Zaporozhye, where Russian forces are already pressing to reclaim the Kiev regime's paltry gains in Robotyne, in Russia's screening zone ahead of their Russian defensive lines. But Russia has more than, according to the Kiev regime, more than 100,000 troops there. And they're probably intended for something more significant than just retaking Robotyne. It is likely that they will move further north towards Orehov and perhaps even Zaporozhye city. In the north, there is also said to be roughly around 100,000 troops as well in the Kupiansk and Liman direction. Now, to put that in comparison, Russia had 40,000 troops in the titanic battles for Avdiivka. So these are rather significant buildup of forces. And Russia is just going to continue on offensives, whether these are slow grinding attrition offensives or eventually something larger on a maneuver scale when they feel that the Kiev regime's military has been degraded significantly enough to make that a less costly in terms of manpower affair than it would be otherwise. The New York Times is talking about the potential for a cascading breakdown of the Kiev regime military at some point this year. That is on the table. That is definitely on the table. It's not just the shell hunger, it's the lack of air defense, Russia's punishment with the FAB guided glide bomb kits, but also an incredible loss of manpower. And even if they get the money from the US and manage to forcibly conscript 500,000 of their own people, they're going to be able to give them at best 2 weeks of training to be able to teach them how to dig a trench with a shovel and which side that you point the gun at, and that's about it. These are not effective replacements for the elite ideological Banderite troops that the Kiev regime has already lost, nor for their absolutely devastated officer corps. So it's really just buying time with lives, with meat.
Yeah, certainly a lot at stake here. And I know we'll have a lot to talk about as we get into the next year. International relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda, thanks so much for your time and insight today.
Thanks for having me.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. If you want to support my work, you can also check out my page on Patreon. That's where you can sign up as a monthly paid subscriber and join the community there. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.